November the 15th, 1315. The first snow of winter dusted the peaks above Lake Ageri in central Switzerland. In the pre-dawn darkness, Duke Leopold I of Austria sat astride his warhorse at the head of a column stretching over half a mile behind him. 2,000 knights in full plate armour, their horses snorting clouds of vapour into the cold mountain air. Behind them 6,000 foot soldiers, levies from Swabia and vassals from across the Habsburg domains. They had marched from Zug before sunrise, confident in their mission to crush the rebellious peasants of Schwyz once and for all. Leopold had every reason for confidence. The House of Habsburg coveted the lands around the Gotthard Pass, the shortest route through the Alps to Italy, and these mountain valleys stood in their way. The forest cantons of Uri, Schwyz and Unterwalden had formed their Swiss Confederacy in 1291, clutching imperial freedom letters that granted them autonomy. But autonomy was one thing. Raiding the Abbey of Einsiedeln, as the men of Schwyz had done the previous year, was quite another. It was an affront to Habsburg authority that could not go unanswered. As Leopold's column moved south along the eastern shore of Lake Ageri, the narrow track squeezed between the lake's dark waters and the steep slopes of Morgarten Heights, the Duke had no reason to suspect danger. An attack by untrained peasants was clearly not expected. His knights were the finest warriors in Europe, men who had trained since childhood in the arts of war. Each wore 60 to 70 pounds of plate armour, mail and padding. Each carried a lance, sword and dagger. These were professional soldiers facing farmers and herdsmen. What Leopold didn't know was that 1,300 men from Schwyz, 200 from Uri, and others from Unterwalden were waiting in the forests above. They had been waiting since before dawn, hidden among the trees on the Figlenfluh ridge. Their leader, Werner Stauffacher, had prepared this ambush with meticulous care. Most of the routes into Schwyz had been blocked. The Austrians would have to come this way, through this narrow passage where the steep slope met the swamp, where cavalry would be useless and numbers would mean nothing. According to legend, an Austrian knight named Henry Hunenberg had actually warned them. Confident in Habsburg superiority, perhaps in an act of chivalry, or perhaps out of contempt for the Swiss peasants, he had shot an arrow into their camp days before. Attached to it was a message stating that the Austrian army would march through Morgarten on November 15th, and advising the Swiss to simply go home. They couldn't win. They shouldn't even try. The Swiss had read that message and smiled. Then they had prepared their trap. About a mile south of Lake Ageri, the Austrian vanguard came to an unexpected halt. A roadblock. Logs and rocks piled across the narrow track. The knights at the front of the column reined in their horses, confusion rippling through their ranks. Behind them, the main body of the army continued marching forward, unaware that the advance had stopped. The column compressed, thousands of men and horses packed into a space barely wide enough for 10 men to stand abreast. Then the mountainside came alive. Boulders began to roll down the slope, not just a few, dozens of them, some as large as a man's torso, gaining speed as they bounced and tumbled down the rocky face of the Figlenfluh. Tree trunks followed, thick logs that had been cut and prepared, now sent crashing down into the packed mass of Austrian soldiers below. Horses screamed and reared. Men shouted warnings that couldn't be heard over the thunder of falling stone and wood. Knights in the front tried to turn their mounts, but there was nowhere to go. The lake to their right, the avalanche to their left, and thousands of their own soldiers packed behind them. The first volley of arrows came next. Not the massed volleys of English longbowmen, but targeted shots from Swiss crossbowmen positioned along the ridge. Then came the Swiss themselves. They emerged from the trees in a wedge formation, running down the slope with gathering momentum, and in their hands they carried a weapon that most of the Austrian knights had never seen in combat, the halberd, part spear, part axe, part hook. A 7-foot shaft of hardwood topped with a blade that combined all three elements, a thrusting spike at the top, an axe blade to one side, and a curved hook on the other. Simple, brutal, devastatingly effective. The Swiss hit the Austrian column like an avalanche of flesh and steel. They waded into the packed mass of knights and foot soldiers, with weapons designed specifically to deal with armoured cavalry. The hook could pull a knight from his saddle, or catch the rim of a helmet and wrench a man's head sideways, exposing his throat. The axe blade could punch through plate armour with the force of a full-armed swing behind a 7-foot lever. The spike could thrust between armour plates or through the vulnerable points at joints and visors. and the Swiss showed no mercy. Chronicles from the period are unanimous on this point. Johannes of Winterthur, writing around 1340, recorded the words of his father who survived the ambush. This was not a battle, but a mere butchery of Duke Leopold's men, for the mountain folk slew them like sheep in the shambles. No quarter was given. They cut down all without distinction. So great was the fierceness of the Confederates that scores of the Austrian foot soldiers, when they saw the bravest knights falling helplessly, threw themselves in panic into the lake, preferring to drown rather than to be hewn about by the dreadful weapons of their enemies. The Austrian knights, trapped in their armour on panicked horses in a space too narrow to manoeuvre, were helpless. Everything they had trained for, everything that made them formidable on an open battlefield, became a liability in this narrow defile. They couldn't charge, they couldn't wheel into formation, they couldn't even effectively swing their swords in the crush of bodies, and the weight of their armour, meant to protect them from sword strokes and lance thrusts, became an anchor dragging them down when they fell. The Swiss halberdiers moved through the Austrian ranks like butchers at work. A halberd blow to the head could split a helmet and the skull beneath. A blow to the shoulder could sever an arm through mail and plate. A thrust to the face could punch through a visor. And the Swiss were fighting for their homes, their freedom, their very existence. The Austrians were fighting for their lord and pay. The difference in motivation showed. At the rear of the column, when news of the ambush filtered back, panic spread faster than any messenger could ride. The foot soldiers turned and fled back toward Zug. The reserve cavalry tried to turn their horses and found the way blocked by their own retreating infantry. Some knights abandoned their mounts and tried to flee on foot, but 60 pounds of armour is not designed for running. The Swiss pursued them without mercy, cutting down those who ran, finishing those who fell. Duke Leopold himself was one of the few nobles to escape. He fled with a handful of surviving knights, leaving behind 1,500 of his soldiers dead on the field or drowned in the lake. The Swiss losses. Chronicles report fewer than a dozen killed. Some accounts say as few as 12. Even if we assume these numbers were exaggerated to make the victory seem more impressive, the disparity is staggering. The Swiss spent the following days stripping the dead. Plate armour, weapons, horses, everything of value was claimed. It was the richest haul they had ever seen. These were not wealthy men. They were farmers and herdsmen, and suddenly they found themselves in possession of equipment worth more than most of them would earn in a lifetime. But the real treasure wasn't the armour or the weapons, it was the knowledge. The Swiss had discovered something that would change the course of medieval warfare. An unarmoured man with a halberd could kill an armoured knight. It seems obvious now, but in 1315 it was revolutionary. For 2 centuries the mounted knight had been the dominant force on European battlefields. Heavy cavalry charges had decided wars. The feudal system itself was built on the military supremacy of the armoured horseman, and Swiss peasants had just proven that supremacy was an illusion. Within a month, in December 1315, representatives of the 3 forest cantons met to reaffirm their mutual defence treaty. This was the Pact of Brunnen, which outlined additional details of cooperation between the signatories. Each canton agreed never to sign a separate peace with the Habsburgs. They would stand together or fall together. This was the true beginning of Switzerland. News of Morgarten spread across Europe. In castles and courts from England to Italy, nobles heard with disbelief that a peasant militia had massacred an army of knights. Some dismissed it as exaggeration. Others wondered if this was an isolated incident, a fluke made possible only by the extreme terrain. The Swiss were seen as primitives who had gotten lucky. Surely in a fair fight on level ground, proper soldiers would triumph. It would take 71 years for someone to test that theory. By 1386, the Swiss Confederacy had grown. Lucerne had joined in 1332, bringing with it a more urban, sophisticated element. The Confederation was no longer just mountain farmers. They had begun to threaten Habsburg interests across the region. In 1385, Swiss forces launched raids on Habsburg strongholds. Zurich attacked Rapperswil. Zug targeted St. Andreas. Lucerne raided south of the Rhine and incorporated the town of Sempach, a direct Habsburg fief, into its sphere of influence. This was more than Duke Leopold III of Austria could tolerate. Unlike his grandfather, who had commanded at Morgarten, Leopold III was an accomplished military commander. He had studied the accounts of that disaster. He knew the Swiss tactics relied on terrain and on facing cavalry. He would give them neither advantage. In the summer of 1386, Leopold assembled an army of 4,000 men. The core of his force was Austrian knights, supplemented by mercenaries and levies from across his domains. He marched south, ostensibly to ravage the Lucerne countryside, perhaps ultimately aiming for the city itself. His army carried mowers with them to cut the crops and destroy the harvests along their route. The town of Willisau was plundered and burned. The Austrian army moved on to Sursee on Lake Sempach, then toward the town of Sempach itself on July 9th. The Swiss response was swift. 1,600 men assembled at the bridge over the Reuss River at Gisakon. Men from Lucerne and the three forest cantons of Uri, Schwyz, and Unterwalden. They marched to intercept Leopold, hoping to catch him at Sempach where he could be pressed against the lake. But both armies encountered each other unexpectedly around noon, about 2 kilometres outside Sempach near the hamlet of Hildisrieden. Neither side was in battle order, both were on the march, but both sides were willing to engage, and they quickly formed ranks. Leopold had learned from Morgarten. He studied the terrain. The ground was not particularly favourable to the Swiss. It was relatively level, with the Swiss holding slightly higher ground near the village. This was not the narrow defile where cavalry would be useless. This was closer to open terrain. But Leopold had read the accounts. He knew the Swiss phalanx had proven effective against cavalry charges, so he made a decision that shocked his knights. He ordered them to dismount. The knights would fight on foot. They would use their lances as pikes, outreaching the shorter Swiss halberds. Their superior plate armour would protect them as they advanced. They would prove that Austrian nobility, even dismounted, could defeat Swiss commoners in infantry combat. There was practical necessity to this decision as well. The knights didn't have time to prepare for engagement. Many wore the long-pointed shoes called poulaines that were fashionable among the nobility. These would hinder movement on foot, so the knights cut off the tips of their shoes before advancing. It was an undignified preparation for battle, but Leopold was determined to show that noble warriors were superior to peasant militia, mounted or dismounted. The Swiss formed their wedge. It was an angular formation, 1 soldier in front followed by 2, then 4, then 8, each rank doubling the one before. The point of the wedge faced the Austrian line. The Swiss were on foot, carrying their halberds and round shields on their left arms to parry blows. They wore far less armour than the Austrians. Leather jerkins, perhaps a mail shirt for the more prosperous simple helmets, but they were confident. They had defeated Austrian knights before. Leopold deployed light crossbowmen to harass the Swiss formation, trying to chip away at it before his main line advanced. Then he ordered his dismounted knights forward. The 1st Austrian Division, the vanguard battle, advanced in tight formation, their lances held forward like a forest of steel-tipped spears. When the two formations met, it was with a crash that could be heard across the valley. The Swiss wedge drove into the Austrian line. The Austrians held. Their lances did outreach the Swiss halberds, and at first this gave them an advantage. The front ranks of the Lucerne contingent took heavy casualties. The Lucerne banner fell. Men were pushed back step by step. Leopold's tactical calculation seemed to be working. The dismounted lance was proving effective against the halberd. But the Swiss had a counter to this. A knight named Anthony Zerpott of Uri cried out to his men to strike with their halberds at the shafts of the lances. He knew the lances were hollow, designed to be light enough for mounted combat. Under repeated blows from heavy halberd axes, they began to break. Then something happened that would become legend. A Swiss soldier named Arnold Winkelried from Unterwalden saw his comrades dying, unable to break through the bristling wall of lance points. He shouted that he would open the way for them. Then he gathered as many lance points as he could into his arms and threw himself forward, using his body weight to drag them down and snap the shafts. He died instantly, impaled on multiple lances, but he had created a gap in the Austrian line. The Swiss halberdiers poured through. What followed was butchery on a scale that horrified even hardened veterans. The halberds swung in great arcs above the Swiss heads. When archaeological teams exhumed the Austrian dead at Sempach in 1898, they discovered something remarkable. Almost all of the Austrian dead had been killed by having their skulls split open by halberds. The forensic evidence confirmed what the chronicles described. The halberd in close combat was murderously effective against armoured opponents. Duke Leopold saw his vanguard breaking. He ordered his 2nd Division forward to counter the Swiss assault, but they advanced in disorder. The Swiss momentum was too great. fresh Swiss troops were still arriving, men who had been positioned further back now joining the fight. They hit the flank of the dismounted knights with devastating effect. The Austrians were exhausted. They had been marching all morning. They had fought in 60 to 70 pounds of armour in the July heat. Chronicles mention the temperature that day, how the heat contributed to Austrian fatigue. Now they faced fresh Swiss troops who had been waiting in reserve. Leopold himself dismounted and led his men into the fight. He was seen holding the line, trying to rally his knights, but the battle was lost. The Austrian 3rd Division, seeing the disaster unfolding, made the calculation that many reserve forces throughout history have made. They rode off the field, fleeing before they could be dragged into the collapse. Their departure sealed the fate of everyone who remained. The Swiss showed the same brutal efficiency they had demonstrated at Morgarten. No quarter, no mercy. The deserted Duke and all those who stood with him were hewn down after desperate resistance. When the Swiss finally held the field, they counted their losses at around 120 to 200 men, more than half of them from Lucerne who had borne the brunt of the initial Austrian assault. The Austrian dead totalled 676 named nobles and knights. Duke Leopold III lay among them, 1 margrave, 3 counts, 5 barons, 7 bannerists, and 63 lesser knights from Austria and Tyrol. These were the names recorded, the men whose deaths mattered enough to be written down. The common soldiers killed alongside them were not counted. Modern estimates suggest total Austrian casualties may have reached 1,500 to 2,000. The political impact was immediate and devastating for the Habsburgs. Already weakened by the division of Habsburg lands in 1379, the loss of Leopold and so many nobles created a power vacuum. Leopoldian control of territories west of the Rhine collapsed over the following years. The death toll among local elites loyal to Habsburg meant there was no one left to enforce Austrian authority. The Swiss Confederacy exploded into the power vacuum. Lucerne consolidated control over towns around Lake Sempesch, Willisau, and the Entlebuch, forming the core of what would become the modern canton of Lucerne. Bern, which had not even participated in the Sempesch War, seized the opportunity to expand, sending expeditions into the Jura, the Oberland, Emmental, and Aargau. By the end of the century, the Swiss Confederacy had transformed from a defensive alliance of mountain valleys into an expanding territorial power. But beyond the political consequences, Sempesch had proven something even more significant. Morgarten could be dismissed as a fluke, an ambush in impossible terrain. Sempesch could not be so easily explained away. The two armies had met on relatively fair ground. The numbers had been closer than at Morgarten. The Austrians had dismounted specifically to counter Swiss tactics. Duke Leopold had done everything right according to the military wisdom of his age, and the Swiss had still destroyed them. The battle demonstrated that Swiss halberdiers could defeat armoured knights, even when those knights fought as heavy infantry. The weapon that had seemed so effective at Morgarten was not just useful in ambushes. In close combat, the halberd was simply superior to the lance when wielded by trained infantry fighting in formation. European military establishments struggled to understand what had happened. How could peasants consistently defeat the finest warriors of the age? The answer lay not just in the halberd itself, but in how the Swiss used it. The halberd was a weapons system, not just a weapon. At its simplest, it was a shaft of hard wood, usually ash or oak, about 7 to 8 feet long. At the top was mounted a complex head that combined 3 elements: a spear point for thrusting, an axe blade for chopping, and a hook or beak for pulling and hooking. The head was mounted in a socket and reinforced with metal straps called langets that ran down the shaft, preventing an enemy from cutting through the wood. But the weapon alone was not enough. The Swiss developed tactics and training that maximised the halberd's effectiveness. They fought in dense formations, wedges or squares depending on the situation. The front ranks carried the longest polearms, pikes of 15 to 18 feet that could outreach cavalry lances. The interior ranks carried halberds, ready to exploit any gap in enemy lines. The rear ranks might carry shorter weapons, two-handed swords or additional halberds. This combination of pike and halberd created a formation that was extremely difficult to break. The pikes prevented cavalry from closing. If cavalry did manage to charge home, they found themselves among the halberdiers, who could drag riders from saddles and finish them on the ground. If enemy infantry tried to close, the halberdiers had the advantage in close combat. The axe blade could shatter shields and armour. The hook could pull enemies off balance or drag them into the formation to be killed. The spike could thrust between armour plates. More importantly, the Swiss trained constantly. These were not feudal levies called up once a year for a few weeks of service. The Swiss militia system required regular training and drill. Men practiced with their weapons from youth. They learned to fight in formation, to maintain cohesion, to respond to commands. By the early 15th century, Swiss pikemen and halberdiers were the most disciplined infantry in Europe. They also developed a reputation for ferocity that bordered on madness. The Swiss rarely took prisoners. They fought to kill, showing the same brutal efficiency they had demonstrated at Morgarten and Sempach. This wasn't just bloodthirstiness. It was tactical. Enemies who knew they would receive no quarter often broke and ran rather than face Swiss infantry. And enemies who did fight to the end were eliminated as threats. The Swiss understood that mercy on the battlefield could lead to facing the same enemies again later. Their success led to a fundamental shift in how they fought. At Morgarten they had relied on terrain. At Sempach they had used terrain but also proved they could win on relatively open ground. By the mid-15th century, Swiss formations were willing to engage anywhere. They developed tactics for every situation. If facing cavalry on open ground, they formed the hedgehog or eagle, a compact square bristling with pikes in every direction. If attacking, they formed columns that could move quickly and hit with concentrated force. If defending, they formed line formations that could hold ground indefinitely. The key to all these tactics was speed and aggression. The Swiss believed the best defence was a devastating attack. They didn't wait for the enemy to come to them. They advanced, regardless of obstacles, regardless of cost. This made them terrifying opponents. Armies facing Swiss columns saw a massive infantry moving toward them at walking pace, their forest of pikes swaying slightly with each step, drums beating time, flags flying, and behind the pikes the halberdiers ready to exploit any breakthrough. By the 1440s, Swiss mercenaries were in high demand across Europe. Kings and princes who couldn't afford to train their own infantry to Swiss standards simply hired Swiss regiments. These mercenaries fought under contracts called capitulations that specified numbers, equipment, pay, and terms of service. Swiss troops served in French armies, Italian city-states, the Holy Roman Empire, and the Papal States. In 1506, Pope Julius II hired 150 Swiss mercenaries led by Peter von Hertenstein to serve as his personal guard. That unit, the Pontifical Swiss Guard, still exists today. They still carry halberds on ceremonial duty at the Vatican, though the weapons are now purely symbolic. But in the 16th century, those halberds were very real, and the Swiss who carried them had proven their effectiveness. The supreme demonstration came on May 6, 1527, during the sack of Rome. 10,000 German Landsknechte, many of them Lutheran who hated the Pope, occupied Rome and began looting. The Swiss Guard, numbering only 189 men, made a fighting retreat to allow Pope Clement VII to escape to Castel Sant'Angelo. 147 of those Swiss Guards died on the steps of St. Peter's Basilica, holding back the Landsknechte long enough for the Pope to reach safety. Only 42 survived. They had fought with halberds against superior numbers and held long enough to complete their mission. But even as Swiss halberdiers were proving their worth, military technology was changing. The introduction of firearms, particularly the arquebus, and then the musket, fundamentally altered battlefield dynamics. At the Battle of Marignano in 1515, Swiss pike columns attacking French positions learned a harsh lesson. French artillery and arquebusiers, protected by earthworks and supported by heavy cavalry, cut down the densely packed Swiss formations in bloody heaps. The Swiss kept advancing as their tactics demanded, but gunpowder weapons firing into mass formations created casualties that even Swiss ferocity couldn't overcome. The Battle of Bicocca in 1522 reinforced the lesson. Swiss mercenaries in French service attacked a Spanish position fortified with earthworks. Spanish arquebusiers firing from behind prepared defences slaughtered the advancing Swiss. For the first time in 2 centuries, Swiss infantry broke and fled. The age of pike and halberd was giving way to the age of gunpowder. But the Swiss adaptation was not instant. Throughout the 16th century, Swiss mercenaries remained among the most capable close-order infantry in Europe. At the Battle of Dreux in 1562, during the French Wars of Religion, a block of Swiss pikemen held the Huguenot army until Catholic cavalry could counterattack. The difference was that Swiss troops were no longer invincible. They were very good infantry who could be defeated by proper tactics and sufficient firepower. The halberd itself remained in use long after it had ceased to be a primary battlefield weapon. It became a symbol of authority, carried by sergeants and officers as a mark of rank. City guards and palace guards carried ceremonial halberds. The weapon that had slaughtered Austrian knights at Morgarten and Sempach became a prop, a reminder of past glory. What had changed was not the weapon, but warfare itself. The tactical revolution that the Swiss had pioneered, the use of disciplined infantry, fighting in formation with pole weapons, had been copied and refined by every military power in Europe. Spanish tercios combined pikemen, arquebusiers, and sword and buckler men into flexible formations that could counter Swiss columns. German Landsknechte adopted Swiss tactics wholesale, even wearing similar clothing and carrying similar weapons. By the 17th century, every European army had pike-armed infantry, and the Swiss were no longer unique. But for 200 years, from 1315 to the early 1500s, Swiss halberdiers had dominated European battlefields. They had transformed from despised peasants to the most feared infantry in the world. Kings paid premium prices for Swiss mercenaries. Commanders studied Swiss tactics. Young soldiers across Europe drilled to emulate Swiss discipline. And it had all started on a cold November morning in 1315, when 1,300 farmers and herdsmen with 7-foot pole weapons had ambushed Duke Leopold's army on the shores of Lake Egeri. The Austrian knights, the finest warriors of their age, had ridden into that narrow pass confident of victory. They never imagined that peasants could defeat them. They had paid for that arrogance with 1,500 lives. 71 years later, Duke Leopold III had tried to correct his grandfather's mistakes. He had dismounted his knights, eliminating the cavalry advantage. He had chosen terrain that didn't favour Swiss tactics. He had done everything medieval military doctrine suggested would lead to victory. And 676 Austrian nobles had died anyway, along with Duke Leopold himself. The Swiss had proven that Morgarten was not a fluke. Given equal or even inferior numbers, Swiss halberdiers could defeat the best troops Europe could field. The weapon itself was remarkably simple. Wood, iron, and steel forged into a brutal tool for killing armoured men. But in the hands of disciplined, trained infantry fighting for their freedom, that simple weapon had rewritten the rules of medieval warfare. It had broken the dominance of heavy cavalry. It had proven that common soldiers could defeat noble knights. It had demonstrated that discipline and training could overcome individual martial prowess. When archaeologists exhumed the mass graves at Sempach in 1898, more than 500 years after the battle, they found the evidence clearly written in bone. Skull after skull split open by halberd blows, the forensic proof of what the chronicles had described. The halberd was not just effective against armour. In the hands of a skilled warrior, it was devastating. Contemporary accounts describe halberd wounds with clinical detail. A blow to the head could split helmet and skull in a single strike. The length of the shaft gave tremendous leverage, and the weight of the axe blade, concentrated in that cutting edge, could generate force that plate armour couldn't resist. A blow to the shoulder could sever an arm through mail and plate. A downward stroke could split a man from crown to chest. These were not wounds, they were dismemberments. The hook was equally lethal in close combat. It could catch the edge of a shield and pull it aside, exposing the man behind. It could hook a helmet and wrench a man's head around, breaking his neck or exposing his throat. It could catch the top edge of a breastplate and pull a man off balance, dragging him down to be finished on the ground. In the press of close combat, that hook gave the halberdier options that a simple spear or sword could not match. And the spike, the thrusting point at the top of the weapon, could punch through mail links or between armour plates. A thrust to the face could penetrate a visor. A thrust to the armpit, where armour was thinnest, could reach vital organs. A thrust to the throat could sever arteries. The halberdier had 3 ways to kill with a single weapon, and he could switch between them in an instant. More than the weapon, it was the men who wielded it that made the difference. The Swiss were fighting for their homes. At Morgarten, they were defending their valleys against Habsburg aggression. At Sempach, they were defending cities and towns they had incorporated into their confederation. This was not abstract loyalty to a distant lord. This was defense of family, community, and freedom. That motivation translated into battlefield performance that shocked medieval observers. Swiss formations didn't break, they didn't root. When faced with cavalry charges that would scatter feudal levies, Swiss pike squares held firm. When facing superior numbers, Swiss wedges kept advancing. The chronicles repeatedly describe this quality. Swiss troops, once committed to battle, fought with what seemed like inhuman determination. Part of this was psychological warfare. The Swiss had learned that reputation could win battles before they began. Enemies who heard they would face Swiss troops often chose not to fight at all, and enemies who did fight often broke when they realized the Swiss would show no mercy. The certainty of death if captured or defeated was sometimes enough to cause panic, but reputation alone would not have sustained Swiss dominance for 2 centuries. What made them consistently successful was their system. The Swiss Confederation developed a military culture that pervaded their society. Young men trained with weapons as a matter of course. Militia musters were regular and serious affairs, not the casual gatherings common in other European states. Standards were enforced. Men who could not meet the physical requirements or demonstrate competence with their weapons were not permitted to serve in the front ranks. This created a virtuous cycle. Success on the battlefield enhanced Swiss reputation. Enhanced reputation led to demand for Swiss mercenaries. Mercenary service provided experienced soldiers who returned home and trained the next generation. That next generation went into battle with better training and more knowledge than their predecessors, and so Swiss military effectiveness continued to improve even as their enemies learned to counter their tactics. The tactical flexibility the Swiss demonstrated was remarkable for the period. At Morgarten, they had used terrain and surprise. At Sempach, they had fought a meeting engagement on relatively open ground. In later battles, they adapted to deserts in Italy, forests in France, mountains in their home valleys. They developed different formations for different situations. They learned to coordinate pikes, halberds, and eventually firearms into combined arms tactics. This adaptability is often overlooked in discussions of Swiss military success. The common narrative presents Swiss tactics as rigid, always attacking in dense columns regardless of circumstances. The reality was more nuanced. Yes, the Swiss preferred aggressive tactics. Yes, they believed in decisive engagement. But Swiss commanders were capable of tactical sophistication when the situation demanded it. What ended Swiss military dominance was not inferior weapons or tactics, but the fundamental transformation of warfare brought by gunpowder. A man with a halberd required years of training to be effective in formation combat. A man with an arquebus could be trained in weeks. A halberd could kill one enemy at a time. An arquebus ball could pass through the first man it hit and wound or kill a second behind him. A formation of halberdiers had to close with the enemy to be effective. Arquebusiers could kill from 200 yards away. When firearms became reliable and common enough to equip entire formations, the tactical calculus changed. Dense pike and halberd columns became target-rich environments. Artillery firing canister shot into packed formations could inflict dozens of casualties with a single discharge. The aggressive tactics that had made the Swiss feared became suicidal when facing massed gunfire from prepared positions. The Swiss adapted slowly. They incorporated arquebusiers into their formations. They learned to use terrain for cover. They modified their tactics to account for gunpowder weapons. But they were no longer unique, and they were no longer unstoppable. By the mid-16th century, every major European power had learned the lessons the Swiss had taught. Professional infantry, trained to fight in formation, armed with pikes and firearms, had become the standard. The Swiss were simply one option among many. But for those 200 years they had been supreme, and it had started with a weapon, a simple polearm that combined spear, axe, and hook into a tool perfectly designed for defeating armoured cavalry. The halberd was not the first pole weapon, nor the last, but in the hands of Swiss infantry fighting for their independence, it became the symbol of a military revolution. The Battle of Morgarten in 1315 had been the announcement. The Battle of Sempach in 1386 had been the confirmation. Swiss halberdiers could tear through Austrian elite cavalry, whether those cavalry were mounted or dismounted, whether the terrain favoured Swiss tactics or not. The weapon, the training, the motivation and the tactics combined to create the most effective infantry force of the late medieval period. When Duke Leopold I of Austria had led his army into that narrow pass beside Lake Egeri, he had never imagined that peasants could threaten professional soldiers. When Duke Leopold III had dismounted his knights to fight the Swiss on foot, he had believed noble warriors would triumph over common militia. Both had been wrong, both had paid with their lives, and the Swiss Confederacy that had been born in those battles would survive to become the Switzerland we know today. The halberd itself can still be seen in museums across Switzerland. These weapons are works of art as much as tools of war. The blades are often etched with decorative patterns. The shafts are smoothly finished, designed to be comfortable in the hands for hours of march and combat. They are deceptively simple looking, until you lift one and feel the weight, until you imagine swinging that axe blade with 7 feet of leverage behind it, until you picture the damage it could inflict on an armoured man. In the chapel at Sempach, near the battlefield where Duke Leopold fell, there's a list of the dead inscribed on the walls, Swiss names on one side, Austrian names on the other. The disparity in numbers tells the story more clearly than any chronicle. 120 Swiss, 676 Austrians, and those were just the nobles worth recording by name. Every year on November 15th, Switzerland commemorates the Battle of Morgarten. There are church services, processions with participants in 14th century costume, speeches recounting the battle, and a shooting competition. The emphasis on marksmanship is telling. The Swiss remember that their ancestors defeated professional soldiers through skill and discipline, not just courage or luck. The story of Swiss Halberdiers tearing through Austria's elite cavalry is ultimately a story about the power of motivated, trained infantry. It's about the ability of common soldiers to defeat supposed military elites when those common soldiers have effective weapons, solid training, and reasons to fight. It's about tactical innovation and the willingness to develop new approaches to warfare. And it's about the simple effectiveness of a well-designed weapon in skilled hands. For the Austrian knights who rode into those battles, it was a lesson learned too late. They had believed their armour, their horses, their lifetime of martial training made them invincible against peasants. They had never considered that peasants with the right weapon and the right training could be more than a match for noble cavalry. They had underestimated their enemies, and that underestimation had been fatal. For the Swiss, those battles were the foundation of national identity. They had proven that free men fighting for their homes could defeat professional armies serving distant lords. They had established the principle that Swiss independence would be defended with Swiss blood, and they had demonstrated that innovation and discipline could overcome tradition and prestige. The halberd was the weapon that made it possible. But the weapon was only as effective as the men who wielded it, and the Swiss proved they were the most effective infantry of their age. When Swiss halberdiers tore through Austria's elite cavalry, they changed the course of military history and established a legacy that lasted for 2 centuries. The transformation of Swiss military power after Sempach was not instantaneous, but it was inexorable. By 1388, just 2 years after the battle, the Peace of Zurich formalised what the battlefield had already decided. The Habsburgs recognised the independence of the Swiss Confederacy. They acknowledged the loss of territories they had claimed for generations. Leopold III's death and the destruction of so many Austrian nobles had created a power vacuum that could not be filled. The Swiss had won not just battles but their freedom. But victory brought new challenges. The Swiss Confederacy was not a unified state in any modern sense. It was a loose alliance of fiercely independent cantons, each with its own government, its own interests and its own traditions. The only thing that truly united them was mutual defence and their shared military system. That system, built around the halberd and pike, would define Swiss identity for the next 200 years. By 1400, the reputation of Swiss infantry had spread across Europe. Chronicles and letters from the period mention the Swiss consistently. They are described as ferocious, unstoppable, and utterly without mercy. Italian city-states, locked in perpetual warfare with each other, began hiring Swiss mercenaries. The condottieri, professional military contractors who had dominated Italian warfare, found themselves facing Swiss pike squares and discovering that their cavalry-heavy forces were obsolete. The Battle of Arbedo in 1422 demonstrated Swiss capabilities in a new environment. Milan, under Duke Filippo Maria Visconti, sought to control the Alpine passes. Swiss forces from Uri and Obwalden, numbering around 3,000 men, faced a Milanese army of 15,000. The Milanese commander, Francesco Carmagnola, was one of the most successful condottieri of his generation. He had cavalry, crossbowmen, and the numerical advantage. The Swiss had their halberds and pikes. Carmagnola attempted to use his cavalry to break the Swiss formation. Multiple charges failed to penetrate the bristling wall of pikes. The Swiss maintained their discipline, holding formation despite being outnumbered 5-1. When Milanese cavalry tried to flank them, Swiss halberdiers broke from the main formation, charged the horsemen and drove them back. The battle lasted hours, with the Swiss refusing to break despite heavy casualties. Eventually the Swiss were forced to withdraw, but it was an organised retreat, not a rout. They had inflicted disproportionate casualties on the Milanese, killing or wounding over 2,000 enemy soldiers, while losing 300 of their own. More importantly, they had fought a much larger professional army to a standstill. Carmagnola himself was impressed enough that he later hired Swiss troops for his own campaigns. The message was clear. Swiss infantry could hold their own against the best Italy had to offer. The demand for Swiss mercenaries exploded. By the 1440s, Swiss troops were fighting in Italy, France, Burgundy, and the Holy Roman Empire. They fought for whoever could pay, and they commanded premium wages. A Swiss pikeman could earn 3 to 4 times what an ordinary foot soldier received. Swiss commanders negotiated contracts that specified not just pay, but food quality, baggage allowances, and conditions of service. Swiss troops expected to be treated as professional soldiers, not expendable levies. This mercenary service had profound effects on Swiss society. Young men left their valleys to fight in foreign wars, returning with money, experience, and stories. The wealth flowing into Swiss cantons from mercenary contracts helped fund infrastructure, churches, and civic improvements. Towns like Lucerne grew prosperous partly on the wages their sons earned, wielding halberds in Italian wars. But there was a darker side. Swiss men were dying in foreign lands for foreign causes, and the constant drain of military-age males created social tensions. The Swiss attempted to regulate mercenary service through pension agreements, contracts between Swiss cantons and foreign powers that formalised the terms under which Swiss troops could be hired. The first major pension agreement was signed with France in 1453. King Charles VII, impressed by Swiss performance in various Italian campaigns, negotiated a treaty that gave France priority access to Swiss troops in exchange for annual payments and various trade privileges. This French pension would remain a fixture of Swiss politics for over 3 centuries, but serving as mercenaries for multiple masters created conflicts. In 1475, Swiss troops found themselves on both sides of a war. Duke Charles the Bold of Burgundy, one of the wealthiest and most powerful nobles in Europe, hired Swiss mercenaries for his army. Simultaneously, other Swiss troops were fighting for his enemies. This situation was untenable and contributed to a crisis that would see the Swiss Confederacy go to war with Burgundy itself. Charles the Bold was attempting to create a unified Burgundian state stretching from the North Sea to the Mediterranean, linking his territories in the Netherlands with Burgundy and threatening to encircle France. He had built what many considered the finest army in Europe: heavily armoured cavalry, English longbowmen, Italian crossbowmen, pikemen, and the most advanced artillery of the age. His forces were well trained, well equipped, and led by a commander who fancied himself a new Alexander the Great. In 1474, Burgundian expansion threatened Habsburg territories in Alsace. The Habsburg Archduke Sigismund, financially strained and unable to defend his lands, pawned the territories to Charles. This put Burgundian forces directly on the Swiss border. When Charles began occupying towns and fortresses in the region, including some claimed by Swiss allies, conflict became inevitable. The Swiss Confederacy declared war on Burgundy in 1474, beginning a conflict that would culminate in 3 of the most decisive battles of the 15th century. The Battle of Grandson on March 2nd, 1476 was the first major engagement. Charles had besieged the town of Grandson on Lake Neuchâtel. When the town surrendered under terms of safe conduct, Charles violated the agreement and hanged the entire garrison of 412 men. This brutality enraged the Swiss, who were already marching to relieve the town. 18,000 Swiss troops approached Grandson, organised into 3 massive columns, the traditional Swiss formation for offensive operations. Charles had his entire army, estimated at 20,000 men, deployed outside Grandson. He had cavalry, artillery, and infantry in prepared positions. He had every advantage except one. He was facing Swiss troops who had just learned that their comrades had been murdered after surrendering under guarantee of safe conduct. The Swiss were not coming to fight a battle, they were coming for vengeance. The engagement began with Burgundian cavalry probing the Swiss columns. The horsemen quickly discovered what Austrian cavalry had learned 160 years earlier. Charging Swiss pike squares was suicide. The cavalry fell back, and Charles deployed his infantry and artillery. His cannon began firing into the advancing Swiss formations. Men fell, but the columns kept coming. Swiss troops had learned to accept casualties from artillery. The guns could kill individuals, but they couldn't break formations. When the Swiss closed to contact range, they struck with overwhelming force. The first Burgundian infantry line shattered. Charles personally led his heavy cavalry in a counterattack, trying to stem the Swiss advance. It failed. The Swiss halberdiers pulled knights from their saddles and butchered them on the ground. The Burgundian army, despite superior numbers and position, broke and ran. Charles himself barely escaped, fleeing so quickly that he abandoned his camp, his treasure, and his artillery. The Swiss captured the entire Burgundian baggage train. What they found astonished them. Charles had been travelling with a treasury that included gold, silver, jewellery, fine tapestries, elaborate tents, and personal items of incredible value. The Duke of Burgundy had taken his entire court on campaign, living in luxury even while besieging towns. The Swiss, practical soldiers from mountain valleys, were stunned by the wealth. They divided the loot according to established rules, with shares allocated based on rank and canton. Many Swiss soldiers became wealthy overnight. Some of the treasure is still in Swiss museums today, including the famous Burgundian diamonds, though the largest diamond, the Sancy, was later sold and passed through various royal collections. But Charles was not finished. He rebuilt his army over the summer, hiring mercenaries from across Europe. By June 1476 he had assembled 20,000 fresh troops. He marched on Meurten, a town allied with the Swiss, and laid siege. The Swiss mobilised again, gathering 25,000 men from across the Confederacy. Duke René II of Lorraine joined with an additional 10,000 troops, giving the relief force numerical superiority. The Battle of Meurten on June 22, 1476 would be even more decisive than Grandson. Charles had learned from his previous defeat. He fortified his camp with earthworks and palisades. He positioned his artillery to cover approaches. He deployed his troops in depth, with reserves ready to counter any breakthrough. He had done everything medieval military doctrine recommended. It would not be enough. The Swiss attacked through a forest, emerging unexpectedly close to the Burgundian positions. Charles had been confident the forest was too dense for large formations to traverse. He had underestimated Swiss mobility. The Swiss columns hit the Burgundian flank before Charles could fully deploy his army. What followed was a massacre. The Burgundian earthworks that were meant to protect against Swiss assault instead trapped Burgundian soldiers when the Swiss broke through. Packed against their own fortifications with no room to manoeuvre, Burgundian infantry were cut down by halberd and pike. Those who tried to flee found themselves driven toward Lake Meurten. Chronicles report that so many Burgundians drowned in the lake that their bodies formed a bridge that survivors tried to walk across. The numbers are likely exaggerated, but the basic fact is not disputed. Thousands of Burgundian soldiers died trying to escape through the lake. Charles lost over 10,000 men at Meurten, possibly as many as 12,000. The Swiss and their allies lost less than 200. It was one of the most lopsided victories in medieval military history. Charles fled again, his reputation as a military commander shattered. The finest army money could buy had been destroyed by Swiss halberdiers and pikemen in a battle that lasted less than 4 hours. Charles rebuilt his army a third time, demonstrating either remarkable determination or spectacular stupidity. By January 1477, he had 10,000 troops, less than half his strength at Meurten, but still a formidable force. He laid siege to Nancy, capital of Lorraine. Duke René called for Swiss assistance, and 8,000 Swiss troops marched through winter conditions to reach Nancy. The Battle of Nancy on January 5, 1477, ended the Burgundian Wars and Charles the Bold. The battle followed the pattern of Grandson and Meurten. The Swiss attacked in columns, punched through the Burgundian lines, and turned the engagement into a rout. Charles, commanding his cavalry in a counterattack, was unhorsed and killed. His body was found days later, partially frozen in a pond, his skull split open by a halberd. The Duke of Burgundy, who had sought to rival kings and build an empire, died in the mud, his face so disfigured that identification was difficult. The Burgundian Wars established Swiss military dominance beyond any doubt. They had destroyed the most powerful military force of the age in 3 successive battles. Charles the Bold had fielded modern armies with combined arms, professional troops, and sophisticated logistics. The Swiss had defeated him 3 times with tactics that were fundamentally medieval, pike and halberd formations charging forward with minimal tactical sophistication but overwhelming determination. European military establishments studied these battles obsessively. How had the Swiss consistently defeated larger, better-equipped armies? The answer seemed to be a combination of factors. Swiss troops fought in deeper formations than most contemporary infantry, giving them weight and momentum in the attack. They maintained stricter discipline, refusing to break formation to loot until the battle was won. They advanced quickly, closing with the enemy before artillery and archery could inflict crippling casualties. And they wielded weapons specifically designed to defeat armoured opponents in close combat. The halberd remained the signature weapon of Swiss infantry, but its role had evolved. By the late 15th century, Swiss formations typically placed pikemen in the front ranks, their 18-foot pikes creating a barrier that prevented cavalry charges and kept enemy infantry at a distance. Behind the pikemen came the halberdiers, ready to exploit any gap in the enemy line. The halberd was no longer the primary defensive weapon. It had become an offensive tool used once the pikes had created an opening. This combination of pike and halberd was devastatingly effective. The pikes held enemies at bay. The halberds killed them when they tried to close. Swiss formations could defend against cavalry, infantry, or mixed forces with equal effectiveness. And once the Swiss went on the offensive, their momentum was nearly impossible to stop. Formations that tried to stand against a Swiss charge were overwhelmed. Formations that broke and ran were hunted down and slaughtered. The reputation for brutality that the Swiss had earned was well deserved. They rarely took prisoners during battle. Wounded enemies were often killed where they lay. Garrison troops that resisted were frequently massacred after surrender. This wasn't simple bloodlust. It was calculated policy. Enemies who knew they would receive no quarter often fled rather than fight, and those who did fight to the end were eliminated as threats. From a strategic perspective, Swiss brutality was effective. From a humanitarian perspective, it was horrifying. By 1480, Swiss mercenaries were the most sought-after troops in Europe. Pope Sixtus IV hired Swiss guards for the Vatican. The kings of France, having learned the value of Swiss troops, maintained permanent Swiss regiments in French service. Italian city-states competed for Swiss contracts. Even the Holy Roman Emperor hired Swiss mercenaries. The men who'd been dismissed as mountain peasants in 1315 were now the military elite of Europe. But Swiss military dominance was creating internal problems within the Confederacy. The wealth from mercenary service was distributed unevenly. Some cantons, particularly those with larger populations, could provide more soldiers and therefore earned more from pension agreements. This created jealousy and tension. The French pension, which paid annual stipends to Swiss cantons that agreed to provide troops, was particularly divisive. Some cantons wanted to maintain the French alliance, others saw it as a threat to Swiss independence. Religious tensions added to the mix. The Protestant Reformation that began in 1517 split the Swiss Confederacy along confessional lines. Some cantons embraced Protestantism, others remained Catholic. Swiss mercenaries found themselves fighting on opposite sides of religious wars, Swiss Catholics serving the Pope, while Swiss Protestants fought for Protestant princes. The unity that had made Swiss military power possible was fracturing. The Battle of Marignano in 1515 demonstrated both the peak of Swiss military power and the beginning of its decline. The Swiss Confederacy had formed an alliance with Pope Julius II and others to drive the French out of Milan. 20,000 Swiss troops assembled, one of the largest Swiss armies ever fielded. They faced a French army of approximately equal size, but the French had a crucial advantage. They had learned Swiss tactics and developed counters. King Francis I of France deployed his army behind field fortifications. He massed his artillery, having over 70 cannon compared to the Swiss who had none. He positioned his cavalry on the flanks to attack once the Swiss committed to their assault. And he hired German Landsknechte, mercenaries who fought in Swiss style with pikes and halberds, to face the Swiss pike squares directly. The Swiss attacked on September 13, 1515, advancing in their traditional columns against the French position. The French artillery opened fire at long range, cannonballs ploughing through the densely packed Swiss formations. Men died in groups, single cannonballs killing or maiming multiple soldiers. The Swiss kept advancing. They had faced artillery before, They believed they could close the distance and get into melee combat where their halberds and pikes would decide the battle. When they reached the French lines, they found German Landsknechte waiting. Pike faced pike, halberd faced halberd. The two forces were evenly matched in weapons and tactics. The battle became a grinding, bloody stalemate. Swiss columns pushed forward. Landsknecht formations held. Neither side could gain a decisive advantage. The fighting continued into the night, something almost unprecedented in medieval warfare. Soldiers fought by torchlight and moonlight, stabbing at shadows, the battlefield lit by burning wagons and artillery pieces. Dawn on September 14th found both armies exhausted but still engaged. The French brought up fresh artillery and renewed their bombardment. French cavalry, having manoeuvred around the Swiss flanks during the night, attacked from the rear. The Venetian army, allied with France, arrived with reinforcements. The Swiss found themselves surrounded and under fire from all directions. For the first time in 2 centuries, a major Swiss army broke and retreated. Approximately 6,000 Swiss soldiers died at Marignano, the highest casualties the Swiss had suffered in any single battle since they had begun their military dominance. It was a shocking defeat that shattered the myth of Swiss invincibility. Marignano taught European armies that Swiss tactics could be countered. Field fortifications and massed artillery could break Swiss charges. Hiring German Landsknechte to fight in Swiss style neutralized the Swiss tactical advantage. Cavalry used properly could attack Swiss flanks and rear. The Swiss formula for victory had been analysed and defeated. The Swiss Confederacy drew its own conclusions from Marignano. They had lost 6,000 men fighting for foreign interests in a war that had nothing to do with Swiss security. The cost was too high. In 1516, the Swiss signed a peace treaty with France called the Eternal Peace, which remains in effect today, making it one of the longest-lasting peace treaties in history. More significantly, the Swiss adopted a policy of neutrality. They would no longer fight as a nation for foreign powers. Swiss mercenaries would still serve abroad, but Switzerland itself would remain neutral in European conflicts. This policy of neutrality, born from the slaughter at Marignano, would define Switzerland for the next 5 centuries and continues to this day. The Swiss had learned that military power could not sustain their independence indefinitely. Better to remain neutral, profit from mercenary service, and avoid entangling alliances. It was a pragmatic decision that ensured Swiss survival as Europe tore itself apart in the wars of the 16th and 17th centuries. But Swiss mercenaries continued to serve across Europe. The French maintained Swiss regiments until the French Revolution in 1792. The most famous incident came on August 10, 1792, when approximately 900 Swiss guards defending the Tuileries Palace in Paris were massacred by revolutionary mobs. The Swiss fought to the last, following their orders to defend King Louis XVI, even as the king fled and abandoned them. 600 Swiss guards died, most of them killed after they had surrendered. It was a final demonstration of Swiss military discipline and loyalty, even in a hopeless situation. The Lion Monument in Lucerne, carved into a cliff face, commemorates these Swiss guards. The dying lion, pierced by a spear, represents Swiss soldiers dying in foreign service. It remains one of the most visited monuments in Switzerland, a reminder of when Swiss military prowess was sold to the highest bidder. By the early 19th century, Swiss mercenary service was ending. The rise of national armies, the spread of conscription, and changing attitudes towards soldiers of fortune made mercenaries obsolete. The last major Swiss mercenary contracts were terminated in the 1850s. Only the Pontifical Swiss Guard remained, and they had become purely ceremonial by then. But the legacy of Swiss Halberdiers remained embedded in European military culture. The tactics they had pioneered, disciplined infantry fighting in formation with pole weapons, had become the foundation of early modern warfare. Every European army had adopted variations of Swiss tactics. The Spanish tercio, the German Landsknecht regiment, the French pike squares, all derived from Swiss innovations. Even as firearms replaced pole weapons, the emphasis on infantry discipline and formation fighting that the Swiss had championed remained central to military doctrine. The halberd itself persisted as a ceremonial weapon long after it had ceased to be effective on the battlefield. Guard units across Europe carried halberds as symbols of authority. The weapon that had slaughtered Austrian knights at Morgarten and Sempach became a decorative object, its blades polished to a mirror finish, its shaft carved with elaborate designs. Today, you can still see ceremonial halberds carried by the Swiss Guard at the Vatican, by guard units at various European palaces and government buildings, and in museums dedicated to military history. Modern military historians continue to debate the significance of Swiss halberdiers in the evolution of warfare. Some argue they represent a transitional phase between medieval, cavalry-dominated warfare and early modern infantry-dominated warfare. Others see them as the culmination of medieval infantry development, the perfection of pole weapon tactics before gunpowder rendered such weapons obsolete. Still others focus on the social and political implications, the way Swiss military success enabled a confederation of small republics to maintain independence in an age of consolidating monarchies. What is beyond debate is the tactical revolution the Swiss achieved. In 1315, infantry was generally considered inferior to cavalry. Foot soldiers were expected to be swept aside by mounted knights. The Battle of Morgarten began the process of reversing that assumption. By 1386, after Sempach, the assumption was shattered. By the mid-15th century, after the Burgundian Wars, European military establishments had accepted that well-trained infantry with proper weapons and tactics could defeat any cavalry force. This shift had profound social and political implications. The dominance of heavy cavalry had been the military foundation of feudalism. Knights were expensive to equip and train, which gave the nobility a monopoly on military power. If infantry could defeat knights, then the nobility's military monopoly was broken. Common soldiers armed with pikes and halberds could challenge armoured nobles. The Swiss had demonstrated that military power did not require noble birth, expensive equipment, or a lifetime of training from childhood. It required discipline, training, effective weapons, and the will to fight. The Swiss Confederacy itself was proof of this principle. A collection of mountain valleys and small towns had defeated the House of Habsburg, one of the most powerful dynasties in Europe. They had destroyed the Duchy of Burgundy, which had fielded the finest army of the 15th century. They had become a military power that kings and emperors hired and respected. And they had done it not through feudal levies or noble cavalry, but through militia infantry wielding 7-foot pole weapons. The weapon itself, the halberd, was a masterpiece of medieval military engineering. It combined multiple functions into a single tool that could thrust, chop, and hook. It was long enough to provide reach and leverage, short enough to be wielded in formation, simple enough to be manufactured by local blacksmiths, and effective enough to kill the most heavily armoured opponents. In terms of cost-effectiveness and versatility, few medieval weapons could match it. Archaeological finds of medieval halberds reveal the variety of designs. Some had narrow axe blades optimised for penetrating armour. Others had broad blades designed to deliver devastating cuts. The hooks varied from small projections to large curved beaks. The spikes ranged from simple points to elaborate flanged tips. Smiths experimented constantly, trying to find the optimal design. But all shared the basic characteristics: pole weapon combining axe, spear and hook into a unified whole. Modern recreations and testing of halberds have confirmed what medieval chronicles described. A properly forged halberd in the hands of a trained user can split period-accurate helmets, punch through breastplates, and sever limbs through mail. The kinetic energy generated by swinging a 3 to 4 pound steel head on a 7-foot lever is substantial. Modern test cuts on ballistic gel and period armour replicas show that halberd blows generate forces well in excess of what human bone and tissue can withstand. The training required to use a halberd effectively in formation combat was significant but not excessive. Modern historical martial arts practitioners who study medieval combat manuals report that basic competence with a halberd can be achieved in months, true proficiency in a year or two. This is much faster than the decade or more required to train an effective knight. The Swiss advantage was not that their weapons were particularly difficult to master, but that they trained consistently and fought in disciplined formations. Formation fighting was the key to Swiss success. A single halberdier facing a mounted knight was at a disadvantage despite his weapon's effectiveness. But 100 halberdiers in a tight formation were nearly unstoppable. They presented multiple threats from multiple angles. A knight trying to attack the formation found weapons coming at him from directions he couldn't defend. And if he became surrounded, which was likely, in the press of combat, he would be pulled down and killed regardless of his armour or skill. The Swiss had perfected what military theorists call combined arms tactics at the infantry level. Their formations included pikemen for defence and reach, halberdiers for close combat, and later crossbowmen or arquebusiers for range support. Each weapon system covered the weaknesses of the others. Pikes kept enemies at a distance. Halberds killed enemies who got close. Ranged weapons harassed enemies before contact. The result was a flexible, resilient formation that could adapt to different threats. This combined arms approach was revolutionary for infantry. Most medieval armies simply massed their troops and charged or defended depending on circumstances. The Swiss organised their infantry deliberately, placing different weapon types in specific positions to maximise effectiveness. It required training, discipline, and coordination. But it worked. The psychological impact of facing Swiss infantry cannot be overstated. Soldiers across Europe knew the Swiss reputation. They knew Swiss troops didn't take prisoners. They knew Swiss formations didn't break. They knew that fighting Swiss meant a brutal melee where quarter would not be given. This knowledge affected morale before battles even began. Armies facing Swiss often had soldiers desert before contact. Those who stayed fought with the knowledge that defeat meant death. Swiss psychological warfare included their appearance and behaviour. They fought under distinctive cantonal banners. They wore similar clothing, creating a sense of uniformity and discipline. They advanced in silence except for the drums that kept their pace, creating an eerie effect as thousands of armed men marched forward without shouting or crying out. And when they did attack, they did so with such ferocity and determination that enemies often broke rather than face them. The economic impact of Swiss military success was substantial. Mercenary service provided employment for young men who might otherwise have struggled to find work in Switzerland's mountainous terrain. The pension agreements brought steady income to cantonal governments. The loot from victories provided windfalls that enriched communities. Towns used mercenary wealth to build churches, town halls, and fortifications that still stand today. But there was a human cost. Swiss families sent their sons off to fight in foreign wars for foreign masters. Many never returned. The cemeteries of Swiss towns contain memorials to men who died in Italy, France, Germany, Spain. Swiss soldiers died for causes they barely understood in places they had never heard of before joining mercenary companies. The wealth that mercenary service brought was paid for in Swiss blood on battlefields across Europe. The decline of Swiss military dominance came gradually. Marignano in 1515 was a shock, but not fatal. Swiss troops continued to fight effectively for centuries afterward. But they were no longer invincible. They were no longer unique. Every military power had learned their tactics and adapted. The combination of pike and halberd that had revolutionized warfare in the 14th and 15th centuries became standard practice in the 16th century. The Swiss had taught Europe how to fight, and Europe had learned the lesson too well. The rise of firearms accelerated the decline. Early arquebuses and muskets were unreliable and slow to reload, but they had one crucial advantage. They could kill at range. A formation armed with firearms could devastate a pike square before it closed to melee distance. As firearms became more reliable and common, pole weapons became less effective. By the 17th century, the balance had shifted decisively toward gunpowder weapons, but the Swiss adaptation to this changing military landscape showed their characteristic pragmatism. They didn't cling stubbornly to outdated tactics. Swiss mercenary regiments incorporated muskets alongside pikes. They learned to fight in the new style of linear warfare that dominated the 17th and 18th centuries. Swiss troops remained valued mercenaries not because they still fought with halberds, but because they maintained the discipline and reliability that had made them famous. The final chapter of Swiss military service came with the French Revolution. Swiss guards defending the Tuileries Palace in 1792 faced revolutionary mobs armed with muskets and cannon. The Swiss, armed similarly, fought in the old style, holding formation and refusing to break even as they were surrounded and overwhelmed. It was a last demonstration of the discipline that had characterized Swiss soldiers for 5 centuries, and it ended in massacre. After 1792, Swiss mercenary service effectively ended. Napoleon reorganized Europe, creating new states and sweeping away old alliances. The market for mercenaries collapsed as nations built standing armies through conscription. Switzerland itself was occupied by French forces, then reorganized into the Helvetic Republic, then finally reconstituted as the Swiss Confederation in 1815. The modern Swiss state emerged from the Napoleonic Wars with its borders guaranteed by the great powers and its neutrality enshrined in international law. The Swiss Guard at the Vatican remains as the last vestige of Swiss mercenary tradition. They still wear Renaissance-era uniforms. They still carry halberds on ceremonial duty, but their role is purely symbolic. The men who guard the Pope today are Swiss citizens fulfilling a traditional obligation, not mercenaries selling their services to the highest bidder. When you visit Switzerland today, the legacy of the halberd is visible everywhere. Museums display the weapons alongside period armour and paintings depicting famous battles. Town halls feature murals showing Swiss pikemen and halberdiers in combat. Monuments commemorate battles where Swiss troops achieved victory or died in service. The Swiss military today, though small and purely defensive, maintains connections to this heritage through ceremonial units that drill with replica halberds and pikes. The story of Swiss Halberdiers tearing through Austria's elite cavalry is fundamentally a story about military innovation and adaptation. The Swiss took a relatively simple weapon, developed tactics to maximize its effectiveness, trained rigorously, and created a military system that dominated European warfare for 2 centuries. They proved that technological superiority was not just about having the best equipment, but about using available equipment most effectively. The Austrian knights who fell at Morgarten and Sempach represented the old order, military elites whose dominance rested on expensive equipment and lifetime training. The Swiss who killed them represented something new, disciplined citizen soldiers who achieved military effectiveness through training, tactics, and determination rather than individual martial prowess or superior equipment. In many ways, the victories of Swiss halberdiers prefigured the mass armies of the modern era. The halberd itself stands as a symbol of this transformation. It was not an exotic or expensive weapon. It was a tool designed to do a specific job, killing armoured men in close combat, and it did that job excellently. In the hands of motivated, trained soldiers fighting in disciplined formations, it proved more effective than the lances, swords, and armour of the knightly class. Simple, brutal, effective. The halberd embodied the Swiss approach to warfare, and for 200 years that approach dominated European battlefields. From the shores of Lake Ageri to the walls of Nancy, from the mountains of Switzerland to the plains of Lombardy, Swiss halberdiers and pikemen proved that well-trained infantry could defeat any opponent. They changed how Europe fought, how armies were organised, and how military power was understood. They broke the cavalry's dominance and established infantry as the queen of battle. The thunder of halberds splitting helmets and armour echoed across medieval Europe, and that echo shaped the centuries that followed. When Swiss halberdiers tore through Austria's elite cavalry, they did more than win battles. They changed the world.